Hi, it's Alexander Russo with The Grade, and this is the Education Show. And I'm delighted to be here today with Ross Wilson from the Shaw Foundation, who's going to tell us a little bit about his amazing Boston Schools podcast. Ross, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Alex. Good to be here.
For people who might not know you or think you're famous the way I think you're famous, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and about the podcast?
Sure. So, Ross Wilson, I'm the executive director of the Shaw Family Foundation. I have been at the foundation since its inception in 2018. Before that, I spent a career in public schools where I was a teacher, kindergarten teacher, principal, and then central office administrator. And one of the fun things we get to do here at the Shaw Foundation is host a podcast on the Boston School Committee. We have been doing this since the beginning of our work. Well, actually, so we've been doing this. So we've been doing the podcast, Alex, since 2019. This is our seventh year of the podcast, and we watch every school committee meeting in its entire duration. And then the next morning we come in and summarize the school committee meeting. And it is definitely a passion project.
Excellent. These recaps have been invaluable to all sorts of people, and we're going to talk about that. Before we jump in, for people who don't know, how often does the Boston School Committee meet, and how long is a typical meeting?
Yes. So Boston School Committee meeting typically lasts 4 or 5 hours, depending on the topic. We're getting into budget season, so those tend to go a little bit longer. And the Boston School Committee currently meets every other week, so twice a month.
It's a lot. And also, before we get started, what are the big issues that are going to be discussed or debated in the budget and in the rest of the school year?
Sure. I mean, this is really the first year that Boston, like many other large urban districts, are going through budget cuts. With COVID, with federal relief dollars, we've been protected from making cuts, but now with declining enrollment catching up to the school system, loss of federal dollars, the school system is really looking at figuring out where they're making cuts and how they're doing it. And honestly, Alex, I can remember back in the day when I worked in the school system, when I was a principal, we faced cuts almost every year trying to figure out what to do. But many people in leadership roles in schools and in the school system haven't been in a position where they've been having to make hard financial decisions. So that's really what's up for this coming year.
So I got to ask, I'm so glad that you do this podcast, but it's really quite unusual. Why are you doing this? This is something that either a newsroom would do or a parent would do. You guys are the only, to my knowledge, the only foundation produced education podcast out there. Why all the time and effort?
Well, the first reason about just why we do this is many of the decisions that affect those who live in our city and outside of our city happen at these school committee meetings. There's, the future of our city and the health of our city and really of our state is in our students. It's in who we're preparing to be the future leaders of our city and our state. And the school committee controls many of those decisions about policies, who's learning to read, who's not learning to read, all of the things. I mean, now graduation standard, right? And every district in the state of Massachusetts is determining what their graduation standards are. These are really important decisions.
Right.
And they typically happen at the 11th or 12th hour of the day. And many people can't access those decisions or hear the debate around them. And so what we try to do is make a digestible version of school committee where you can hear from school committee members. You could, the listeners can hear the debate. We try to show both sides of any debate. And to follow trends that are happening across meetings. And so even if you could tune into one meeting where you think it's important, it's also important to know what's happened in the previous 5 or 10 meetings or when this topic has been discussed previously. So we try to summarize all of that for listeners. As a foundation, we believe really strongly in helping to improve the educational outcomes for our students in our city. And we think democratizing information is one way to do that.
You do have a little bit of a tie-in with local media. There's a version of the podcast that's put out through WBUR Public Radio. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, we have a partnership with WBUR. They actually produce our podcast. and help market the podcast and cross pollinate it with other podcasts that they produce.
And in sort of a strange moment, the Globe has written the podcast up a couple times, which I always think is quite interesting.
It is for all the times that I criticize our local media coverage, and I believe that there's some topics that should be covered that the Globe hasn't covered. I do commend them for following our podcast and for even writing about our podcast and why it's important.
Let's talk about the state of the local education journalism ecosystem, for lack of a better word. How
Yeah.
are things looking at the beginning of 2026? Better, worse, or about the same?
You know, you're getting me at a time where I'm quite frustrated by local media coverage of education. You know, we just had a school committee appointment, or two appointments made to school committee, and one member left and one member was non-renewed, and nobody has written about the member who was non-renewed. We had a member who was appointed by the mayor. So it's interesting, in Boston Public Schools, we have a mayoral controlled school committee. The mayor appoints some members. They serve at the will and the duration of they serve at the will of the mayor. And one of the most outspoken members, Brandon Cardet Hernandez, who is just a brilliant educator, asked really great questions consistently at school committee, and many people lauded his leadership. And he even got a number of articles in our local media about his leadership on the Boston School Committee. Was non-renewed very quietly right before the new year, and nobody has written about this yet. It's
sort of a Jerome Powell kind of situation.
You know, he's certainly the outcome of him not following along to get along with the mayor's agenda, which he actually wasn't against the mayor's agenda, Alex. He was simply asking questions about enrollment, about budget, about graduation rates, about our students who are underserved, and pushing the school system to provide accurate data in a transparent way. And because of that, I believe he was non-renewed. But I don't know. I haven't talked to the mayor about it. But the media should be covering these things. You know, in our suburban districts, you know, in the city of Cambridge, there's articles written about their school committee and nothing written about the Boston School Committee. I just don't know. I don't know why.
Who's covering or supposed to be covering the Boston School Committee the way that you'd like?
Well, at different times, reporters will attend school committee meetings. Jamie Vasnes, who writes for the Boston Globe, used to attend school committee meetings quite regularly and write about the outcomes of school committee meetings. We don't have that anymore. There is no reporter who goes to every school committee meeting. We do get, you know, occasional reports on school policies when schools are recommended to close or merge, but really nothing of great substance. I'm sorry. I was going to say, Alex, you know, we also have this transportation issue. We spend almost $200 million a year busing students around our city. $200 million a year. It's more than any other district in the country on yellow bus transportation. And we've had quite a number of problems, one of which we had a tragedy where a student was run over by one of these buses, and still there's no culpability. There's no report about what's happened to this, what criminal charges against this driver, and no changes to our bus management company whatsoever. No discussion at school committee, and the local media has been remiss in covering this topic.
What about City Hall reporters? You all are in a mayoral control situation. There's an obvious connection between City Hall and Boston Public Schools. Do any of the City Hall reporters creep over and start poaching on the school's issues, at least from the political side?
Very minimally on the political side. There was a time when you would have City Hall reporters covering things such as collective bargaining agreements, or, you know, what's happening with different negotiations or policy decisions, and it just doesn't happen anymore.
And what's your understanding of why the non-renewal wasn't covered? Why the coverage seems like it's lackluster Boston has more than your average number of education reporters compared to other places.
I can't speak to it, Alex. It just seems to be a shift in priority around education as a topic that people care about. I still believe that my neighbors in Boston care deeply about education. They hit me up every day when I see them on the street and we talk about education at the dog park or on the street when we're bringing our kids to school. And so I know people still care about education. Not sure why our local media is not covering it. I'm
But
not
you're
sure if it's because they don't sell papers or if it's for some other reason.
right. You're thinking though that it might be a readership or a reader interest issue, not something ideological.
That's my guess because papers are in the business of wanting more readers, right? And I would imagine that they would want to meet the interests of their readers.
We talked a lot about the Globe and, of course, about your podcast. Is there anyone out there, regular or occasional, traditional journalist in a traditional newsroom or a non-traditional someone just typing away? Is there anything out there that helps fill out the media ecosystem when it comes to Boston schools?
I do really appreciate Will Austin's newsletter, where Will writes on Fridays and has a great newsletter that takes state data and analyzes it, takes local Boston data, analyzes it, and does a great job of asking good questions, talking about trends in education. I
Right.
find that to be really helpful. The Commonwealth magazine, I think, does a good job on writing longer form pieces when there's a topic of interest for them that I think are very helpful for readers and for those interested in public policy. Um, those are the ones that I turn to.
I haven't talked to those guys yet recently, at least not on camera, but I did talk to Scott Van Voorhis and I did talk to Dan Kennedy, who are
Sure.
both Boston area folks. Scott's view was that there was a overly deferential attitude, that the journalists who were focused on Boston schools and City Hall were deferential was the word he used, rather than skeptical or aggressive. And Dan Kennedy's view was that the deep investigations that a big outlet like the Boston Globe does can be amazing, but that the day-to-day coverage could be, I think he used the word soft. Does any of that resonate with you, or would you disagree with that?
Um, every day since the new year, I read our paper. One of the first things I do in the morning is read our papers. And I've not seen any coverage on important issues, particularly around school committee membership. And I'm astonished that we're on day 13 of the new year. And so I do question, why do we not seeing coverage of important issues that are important in our city? And there could be, to me, there could be no more important issue than the governance of our school system as we enter into the first time in years of budget cuts in our school system. And we just had one of the most lauded members of our school committee removed from our school committee after he went through a process to be renewed on the school committee. I would love to know why. I would love to see local media coverage about why. I would love to see the mayor on the record about why she non-renewed Brandon Cardet Hernandez, but renewed Stephen Alkins, who is also up for renewal at the same exact time. I would love to know the attributes that the mayor is looking for in school committee members. I would love accountability to be happening in our local media, and I have not seen it.
What's the relationship between you and the media? I'm assuming that you guys have each other on speed dial and are calling each other all the time, but maybe that's not the case.
No, I mean, we cover issues that we think are important on school committee. I hope reporters listen to the podcast. But I don't call reporters and implore them to write about any particular topic. But if reporters are interested in listen to the podcast and they have follow-up questions, I'm always happy to answer those questions about the nuances of it.
And does that happen? And do you have a ongoing conversation, or do you get those kinds of calls?
Absolutely. You know, we there's a number of our listeners are not only reporters who listen for content and try to pick it up and want to understand the nuances of particular topics. You know, the most recent has been around a master facilities plan and trying to understand, is there a plan for facilities in our city for future years or not? And so that's been substantive conversation with some reporters about that topic. Uh, but also, Alex, many of our listeners are not, of course, family members and teachers and school leaders, central office administrators, but are local politicians who are talking about these policies at city council or at the state house. And so we do get a lot of calls from those folks wanting to unpack particular issues.
Yeah, I may have told you this before, but I used to run a Chicago schools blog. No video, no audio. I was on the public radio station every month or so talking about what was happening in the schools. And I'm going to say that 80% of the people who wrote and commented, this is in the days when you could write and comment anonymously, they were people on the 10th floor complaining about people on the 8th floor. They were city hall people complaining about the school district, which was mayoral control or vice versa.
Right.
It was both very in-house, but it was also very robust because, frankly, there wasn't a lot of information and people had a lot of issues that were coming up, personality and policy issues. The overall result, if you were willing to wade through the comments and the vitriol, was a really in-depth understanding of schools. Do you guys have comments, by the way? Do you have or allow comments?
Just by email, where I get a lot of them, but no, so we don't have public comments. Maybe we should.
It's something to consider. They're a giant pain in the ass to moderate, and you get crazy people who camp out on your page, but they can be really useful. Speaking of things that have emerged or things you've learned along the way, Colleen Connolly, a contributor for The Grade, interviewed you guys a couple years ago about where things were and how it was going. I've since commissioned a couple of pieces from other towns about parents who started podcasts or newsletters. Right. What have you learned about doing the podcasts to improve it or to make it more useful to people that you weren't doing 2 years ago or 4 or 6 years ago?
So we've and we need to do more of this, but this notion of deep dives or getting into particular topic areas where they're discussed at school committee, mostly in education jargon terms, where people want to get a better understanding of an issue area. So I'll give you an example of inclusive practices for students with disabilities. I mean, people want to know more about, what is the federal law around this? What does that mean to be inclusive? What are the different models of that education? Why isn't Boston doing more of that? What's the history around this? These are the topic area, or for multilingual learners is another topic area that people want to learn more about. What are best practices? There's been ballot initiatives to change policy. So these are, what we want to do more of is to help listeners understand some of these deeper issues. Right now, we're preparing some background on MassCore as a graduation requirement for our state and doing an analysis of what districts use sort of this series of courses that are designed to help kids be prepared to go to our state university. How are they doing towards MassCore? We have a hot take, Alex. I'll give you a hot take right now on this conversation, is that Boston Public Schools adopted MassCore as a graduation requirement for this coming year's class. And they've actually gone from 50% of students meeting MassCore to what the state data from last week showed us that we have 45% of students meeting MassCore currently. So it's a 5% decrease in MassCore completion when we see many other districts at 90% or higher. And we'll have to see then what happens to our graduation rate this coming year. It's never gone down, Alex. It keeps going up. So how will they reconcile a lower rate of students meeting MassCore with wanting to make sure that our graduation rate goes up every year by 1% or 2%? Because that is the common practice in our state, in our city, and in our state.
And are you going to do these deep dives in the context of the 20-minute recaps, or are you building out a whole new line of in-depth explainers?
We think we're going to do some of these in the old-fashioned writing way. Go back to your work in Chicago and maybe write them down and have them a little more of an explainer type, so that folks can refer to it on their own time when they're ready. We were doing them a couple of years ago as interviews with experts, and I think people appreciated that. A smaller group of people appreciated that. Those who are really wanting to get into the educational issues, ed policy people in particular. I think we're going to bring that sort of idea, but bring it to a written form.
And why writing? And also, while we're talking about it, why not video?
I think it's mostly around timeliness and production of these of the and people's time in listening to it. So we think if we can complement a strong school committee podcast along with some written materials, when people can refer to them as they desire, it could work. I'm open to suggestions though.
Well, my suggestion, you may not like it at all. My suggestion is video, and also,
Yeah.
can the Globe, you might hate it, but can someone with a big distribution network take this on or license it from you? I mean, it's just a shame that more people don't see it. It's sitting there for free.
I'm all ears on any context you have over at the Globe. You let me know, Alex. I'm ready to have a conversation. But I think you do raise a really important point, which is, and you had said this earlier. There are some phenomenal people in this country who have, in different cities, have done similar things that we're doing with this podcast. Seattle had, I hope still does, a podcast of two parents who summarize the podcast. Summarize the school committee meeting on a podcast. That local journalism is just so important, and I hope in some way we can marry that with our big papers that are, sometimes some of these big papers they're having a hard time keeping up with content and the economic model. And if we could figure out local journalism and these bigger papers coming together with a partnership, I think that would be really great.
The downside right now, at least, is, to my knowledge, there's no one heading the education team at the Globe. Melissa Tabuada left a little while ago to go back to Texas. Mm-hmm. And there's a new top editor coming in at the Globe, I think, returning to the Globe. But I think things are in a shift. And I'm not clear. You probably remember as well as I do, 6 or 8 years ago when the Great Divide was launched, the Valedictorians Project came on and showed everyone in Boston and nationally that the best and brightest weren't necessarily as well trained as you'd think they were, being valedictorians. But we're now 2 editors in and several reporters. I'm hoping that continues to be a big success and to do great work. But right now, I'm not sure. There is a little bit of a move in journalism, in traditional journalism, reluctantly, with lots of delays and complaints, to adopt some of the non-traditional approaches to media. It's hard to think of podcasts as being non-traditional at this point, but sort of like 20 or 25 years ago, bloggers came along and journalists looked down on them for a long time and then went, oh, that's really popular.
That could work. Right.
That could work. And that's where we got the Ezra Kleins and the Matt Iglesiases of the world and all the explainer journalism that we have. I'm hoping that legacy media will take non-traditional approaches, non-traditional information sharers, let's call you guys that, and bring them into the fold. Because frankly, I don't think readers care as long as the information is accurate and timely, salient to their interests. I don't think people care what you call yourself, as long as you're feeding them news that they find important.
That's right. I agree with you. I think the Boston Globe did have a podcast arm that they I don't know if they have it anymore. Right. But I think your point about partnership is really important. And how do you broaden the umbrella here, and have more opportunities for coverage of local governance. I should say that there are, contrarian. You had mentioned Scott earlier. I mean, these newsletters are really important and are really gaining steam on membership, because people want coverage of these local stories and they want deeper coverage of things that impact them the most.
Right. And people such as yourself or Scott or Will, who have some background knowledge or have the time to dig deep, can get deeper than a lot of reporters can if they've got to cover multiple districts, etc.
Right.
Speaking of which, can you say one or two or three things that people don't know, maybe even education reporters don't know about BPS, that you know because of your lengthy experience? Are there dynamics? You mentioned the $200 million of transportation spending, biggest in the nation. Are there other things about the BPS setup, or the trend lines that folks might not know or might have learned once or heard once but have forgotten?
Yeah, so I think a little bit wonky, but transportation is a really important thing to me. So bus drivers, actually, a few years back, while the city has a contract with Transdev, who then hires the drivers, the
Right,
city actually negotiates with the drivers union around Transdev.
right,
So a few years back, the city signed side letter A and side letter B, which essentially guaranteed the bus drivers jobs for life. They would never change the bus drivers union ever. And that side letter A and B, not really referred to or talked about very much, is what is causing the fact that we have fewer, 10,000 fewer students and more drivers and a higher transportation budget than ever before. And, the city of Boston likes to talk about this as, oh, it's because we bus students with disabilities more door to door. No, it's because we have an incredibly inefficient transportation system and we have bus drivers who have jobs for life, because if the bus drivers didn't have side letter A and B, they would drive slowly, causing a huge issue in the city of Boston, which we've experienced over and over again. But now all of a sudden, drivers are driving more on time because they have guaranteed jobs for life. That's an important topic that has not been covered
that
almost ever.
that's amazing. That reminds me of Chicago's famous parking meter deal, which Mayor Daley touted and turns out to have been sort of the worst deal that any city ever made. The other thing, I covered LA schools for a little while, and there was a guy that no one wrote about, but everyone referred to. I think his name was Dave, who was sort of like he was the guy who knew everything, but didn't want to talk to the press. Or he talked
Right,
about
right,
background, incredibly important guy, knew where all the bodies were, knew people at City Hall. He was like the career guy,
right.
behind the curtain. Does Boston have a Dave? Does Boston have a mover and a shaker? If you wanted to get something done, you'd approach them, and they never appear in print.
I don't know them anymore. I
What
feel like
what was there one in your day?
there was, there was one in Boston in
Who was
BPS.
that? Who was that?
I won't say his name,
Daniel
uh,
Sotza.
but somebody who knew the ins and outs of the whole thing, knew how to make things work. Absolutely. The much of the policy that happens in BPS is written in these labor contracts with our unions, and much of the conversation that we have around inclusive practices and students with disabilities is actually not governed by the needs of those students and their IEPs, but it's governed by whatever decisions we made between adult work conditions. And so when we get down to it, these are things that we should talk more about, and why it is that we spend $35,000 a student, and we continue to see such, only a third of our students are reading at grade level. It's not okay to have that in our city, in our state, for any school system.
Mm-hmm.
And I would just argue, Alex, that we should all care deeply about the outcomes for our students, and I often feel like the expectations are lowered by our superintendent or by others, saying if we only understood the complexity of the students that are being served, we would understand how hard it is. And those statements they bug me the most, Alex. That when we try to boil down young people who are just kids trying to learn into complexity, that's just an excuse for the ineffectiveness of the system. Every student is capable and deserves to have high expectations in our city, in our school system, and so that's what we try to cover. That wasn't a hot take on what's happening in the Boston Public Schools, but it's really important. I'll give you one other. You asked for three. I have given you a veiled answer here, but I think what's really it has been covered a little bit in Will Austin's newsletter and in some other data. Is this really interesting thing that's happened over the past number of years, where we have upwards of 16% increase in staff members outside of schools, staff members, not necessarily teachers or paraprofessionals, but others who are coaches or central office administrators, while we've had a decrease of almost 20% of students. I'm sorry, a decrease of almost 10% of students or more. So it just makes no sense why we would have so many more staff members outside of schools, so many fewer students in our school system, and worse results than we had prior to the pandemic. So it's something we have to question.
Excellent. What's next for last night?
Well, we're gonna have a special guest, Alex, coming on our first episode, and hopefully for a number of other episodes. Brandon Cardet Hernandez, the member of school committee who was non-renewed, will find his voice. Will find his voice as a co-host, a guest co-host on Last Night School Committee. And so, just like you're asking me questions about insider information or what's happening, I can't wait to hear what really happened in Brandon Cardet Hernandez's non-renewal from school committee and what he has planned for next.
Is he allowed to talk, or did they make him sign an NDA?
He is allowed to talk.
Amazing. And when's the next school board meeting? When does this
next Wednesday? So the 21st of January. The 21st of January is next school committee meeting. And we'll have our next episode out on the morning of the 22nd.
Excellent. I'm Alexander Russo with The Grade. This is the Education Show. Ross Wilson, the Shaw Foundation, and Last Night at School Committee. Thank you so much for talking.
Thank you, Alex.